I've got the latest list of the 100 safest banks in the world, and chances are where you're banking isn't on it. This is really important because you've seen bank failures in the last year in the United States. You've heard talk of them in some other Western countries. Where your money is important, and I think this is an interesting opportunity to diversify. Here's the headlines. The number one safest bank in the world is in Germany. But if you don't live in Germany, you're probably not going to be able to bank there. I'm going to go through the list of which banks are good. I'm going to tell you which ones are accessible. Some of the best are actually in Singapore, and we're going to talk about that. So let's go through the list of the 100 safest banks in the world. All right, so every year, Global Finance Magazine publishes the strongest banks. It used to be the 50 strongest banks. Now it's the 100 strongest banks. If you're watching this in the United States, JP Morgan, Bank of America are the top banks on this list. Other than some farm banks, which I don't think most people are dealing with, they come in at 68th and 69th, respectively. They are right behind BNP Paribas in France, which just fell out of bed recently, and their stock was in the tank recently. So 68th and 69th, if you're banking with one of those big U.S. banks, that's where you are. If you're from Canada, if you're from Australia, your banks actually score higher. And yet what's interesting is it's not just about strength, because a lot of Canadian and Australian clients tell us their banks are very restrictive. What do you want your money for? So there's obviously the strength part, and then there's also the flexibility. Can you use the account part? What I think a lot of people who are first looking to diversify internationally don't realize is most of these banks don't want your money. There's especially been a push, just an ongoing push, but I think especially in the last 10 years, banks really want, often under pressure from their central bank, who are often under pressure from the U.S. federal, the central bank and the U.S. government. They don't want to open accounts for non-residents. There are certain banks in places like Hong Kong, which are just very conservative, very strong balance sheets. They're like, we don't need more money, so if we don't understand, why would we take the risk? It's just a very cautious approach. Not a bad bank to have. There's ways you can get residence permits that then allow you to, as a resident, open that bank account. Sometimes being a citizen opens that up. And so if you want to diversify your assets, really the thing you should be asking is, where should I be a resident? Where should I be a citizen to open up more opportunities? Because the number of banks on this list that you can just go and deal with is not that high, and the numbers that you need to deposit are going to be higher. So let's just go through it. I'll give you a couple tips at the end about alternatives and ways you can play this list. But it's an eye-opener, if nothing else, because it means that your bank really isn't that high. So KfW in Germany comes in at number one. Then you've got the cantonal bank in Zurich. So Switzerland has all these different banks. Each canton generally has a cantonal bank. They come in at number two. They're always very strong. Will they tell you that they can open you an account? Potentially. And I think if you know the right people, you can open one. One of our biggest things at Nomad Capitalist, we've got 5.5, basically, full-time R&D people. All we do is build relationships with people all over the world for immigration, for tax, for banking. Relationships are what make the difference in banking. If you have a great relationship with a bank, you can often get accounts that you might not be able to get just walking in off the street. I think a lot of people looking at doing this think, oh, I'll just walk in off the street and they'll take my money. Especially in the West, and probably, I'm sorry to say, especially Americans. Well, I have American money. I'm putting in $100,000. They don't need your $100,000. What they want is to know that you're going to be a good bet for the bank, and they're not going to have any fallout. Then you've got banks in the Netherlands, a bunch of banks in Germany, in Norway. Some of the top 10 banks are generally kind of more local banks in some of these countries. So Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland, these are not generally very accessible. The big bank that you've probably heard about is the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC. Stock has done all right recently. That's one thing you can do, by the way, if you can't actually get a bank account there, so you could play the stocks of some of these if you want, safe investments. You see a lot of people who've invested for higher yields, for example, in some of these smaller or mid-level U.S. banks. 3 banks last year, you got wiped out. Playing some of these stronger banks may give you some diversification. You can buy Royal Bank of Canada stock on the Canadian stock market and have a Canadian dollar exposure. It's not that much different maybe than the U.S., but it's the 10th strongest bank in the world. Then we're back to some of the smaller banks like in France. Here's, to me, the most accessible banks on this list, and that is DBS Bank in Singapore. That is the largest bank in Singapore, wins all kinds of awards. Then OCBC in Singapore, and then UOB in Singapore. So 12, 13, and 14. Singapore's become more difficult for non-residents in recent years. I went to a dinner hosted by one of these 3 banks a couple months ago, and the banker told me a story. that sums up everything that I've said to you for years. She said, I'd much rather have a wealthy Indonesian than a wealthy American. Because the wealthier Indonesian generally puts more of their money in the banks, which is more business to have. And there's a lot fewer regulations to deal with taking money from Indonesians than from Americans, where we've got to comply with all the different regulations. The Americans can't make investments. It's just much more profitable us to take. And we understand why the Indonesian guy wants to come and put his money in Singapore. We don't understand why the American wouldn't come. Bankers don't understand that like the Western financial system is not what it once was. They just understand banker terms. If you're like, holy cow, the U.S. or Canada or Australia is going to the tubes, like, what are you talking about? We don't see it as that. And yet, obviously, a lot of people in the West are concerned, like they can't get their own money out of their bank. Their bank asks them a million questions. There's no yield on their money. Like, banks in the U.S. are failing. They just don't feel secure. The banks in Singapore aren't going to understand that you want that. However, these banks, sometimes you should know somebody. If you're wanting to get into their priority level banking, we're talking 200 to 350,000. They will open for you if you know either how to go about it. I don't think you can just walk in, but if you make an appointment, or if you can have someone introduce you. I think it's more hit or miss if you make an appointment. We had a client who had probably $500 or $600 million, and he said, I really had to convince one of those Singaporean banks to like, please take my business. I want to have 3 banks around the world. We were able to help him kind of facilitate that because, you know, we get invited to these kinds of things. But to me, Singapore is the part of the world, it's transactional banking. It's a lot lower cost than Switzerland. These are all publicly traded companies. I own stock in 2 of those 3 banks. They've done well. They're great tax-free dividend plays. I mean, to me, for a yield play, it's a great stock to hold, in my personal opinion. But, I mean, the Singaporean banks literally lend the central bank in Singapore money sometimes. I mean, they're very stable banks, but they're accessible. They're more transactional. I think it's actually probably harder to get into the private banks with some of those banks. They're very particular about that. But the priority level, I think, would be a place that I would look at. And it's maybe at 200 to 350,000 Sing dollar minimum. So, you know, low 6 figures USD. They're going to want to know why you're there. And if you come like, you know, telling them about your taxes and the world's crashing, I mean, that's not going to be interesting to them. You want diversification. And sadly, if you're an American, these banks are not going to let you invest just because that's what your own country does, which is why we talk about getting second passports. If you're a really high-level investor, maybe having a U.S. passport, maybe having some other passports that have all these regulations on what you can invest in, at some point, it's not worth it with the taxes and the regulations. So that's Singapore. I think the most accessible banks on this list that just offer the whole thing. They're flexible. Obviously, they have plenty of rules, but they're a bit more flexible. They're a bit more user-friendly. The fees are lower. They're more transparent than Swiss banks. I'm a fan of Singapore. Doesn't mean it works for everybody. Svenska Handelsbanken in Sweden, done very well owning the stock, but not an accessible bank for you. Then you've got banks in Korea and France, more in Switzerland, in Luxembourg. There are some banks in Luxembourg that are accessible. There are some banks in Switzerland that are accessible. You're looking at certainly $500,000, and I think in Switzerland you're probably looking at closer to $1 million. We've got 2 or 3 main banks we would work with in Switzerland, and they're really going to be they're going to focus on where you live. So an American might put in $1 million, but if you have a tax residence in a more exotic place, we recently had someone get asked for $5 million with one of the larger banks. But these teeny tiny Swiss banks generally don't want you. I think people sometimes think, like, if I go to the smaller banks, they'll be more open. In both large markets and small, I've seen this happen, both in like a place like Switzerland or Luxembourg, but also in a country like Georgia, where we talk about as a very accessible market for put $1,000 in, just, you know, kind of build a tunnel, as we call it, where, you know, the big banks, TBC and Bank of Georgia, they're a lot more likely to take you. They're publicly traded banks than the Turkish bank, which has 1 branch. You think, oh, they have 1 branch, they want to build up. No, they're not interested. They're there for one reason. They want Turkish people who are doing business in Georgia to bank with them, or the Chinese bank. They want people who are from China who are coming to Georgia to do business with them. And so it's often these smaller banks, the Cantonal Bank in Switzerland. If you know the right person, potentially you can get an account. But, you know, when you're going offshore, sometimes the bigger banks, like these in Singapore, you go to like the Indian bank, you're like, oh, this bank doesn't have very much of a presence. They'll be more likely to take me. They're going to kick you out so fast your head will spin. It's the bigger ones that sometimes work. More banks in Canada. Canadian banks have fallen down the rankings in recent years. They're still higher than U.S. banks. Australian banks have actually fallen quite a bit down the rankings. They used to be in the top 20. They're all down in the mid-30s now. You're seeing banks in the UAE creeping up. So First Abu Dhabi Bank, I think it's the largest bank in the UAE. That comes in ranked 31. Nordea Bank in Finland, not as good of a stock performance this year. So if you're in Canada, I mean, your bank, in terms of like Western audiences, in terms of the larger banks, the big six, I think, in Canada, those rank higher. I mean, you don't see some of the largest banks in France or Norway, generally speaking, at the top of the list. Canada has kind of where the big banks are the strongest, but they have fallen. And I think when it comes to just everyday user experience, our clients are more and more frustrated with them. So that's the problem. That's where Singapore would outperform them. You got a lot of smaller banks. You see, Pictet in Switzerland's on there. That's one that could be accessible. You're talking 7 figures and up with them. Australian banks, again, have fallen. You've got New Zealand Bank here in the middle of the pack. The French banks used to be stronger. They've also kind of fallen a little bit. Crédit Agricole, great stock, but 47th on the list. You've seen some banks in Liechtenstein in the middle of the list. So LGT in Liechtenstein, depending on where you're from, that could be a place to open an account, generally 7 figures. If you are offshore, maybe high 6 figures. Then you get into the farm banks in the U.S. Right behind them are some of the state-owned banks in China. Then we get into some of the Korean banks like, Shinhan. By the way, if you haven't noticed, I mean, buying stocks in banks overseas, you can buy a Singapore bank stock. There's no tax on dividends in Singapore or in Hong Kong. Now, where you live, there might be a tax on dividends. And so I like to look at, if you're thinking, where can I bank offshore? Look at the whole picture. I don't think anybody does that like Nomad Capitalist does. We like to look at the whole picture. We call it a holistic plan. I see a bunch of yahoos trying to just use the word holistic now. They haven't spent the millions that we've spent researching all this stuff and how it works. So you probably don't just want a bank account offshore. Sometimes people call us and say, how much will you charge me to open an account at the Bank of China, Hong Kong? We don't do a la carte because with banks, maybe I could open you an account at Bank of China, Hong Kong, but the next guy who's pretty similar, they're going to have some issue with him. You want to look at the, multiple different banks. In Singapore, different people are going to have different profiles for different banks. I think DBS is a well-run bank. UOB is not as well-run of a bank, but they're equally safe, and maybe UOB takes someone that DBS doesn't. There's so much detail here. And then again, it comes down to if you got a residence permit somewhere else, you'd have some of these larger, these safer European banks you could open up. But if you're just an American or living somewhere else, you can't. So there's such a holistic picture to understand. And then I ask, why are you trying to open an offshore bank account? You want to have a plan to diversify and protect your money. That's what Nomad Capitalist helps you do. So if you just go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply, you'll learn why paying a fee for some advice is probably going to pay off a lot more in the long run. Take it from me, who wishes I could have paid someone what we charge rather than millions to often learn the hard way. So let's keep going through the list. I mean, here's the U.S. I do see Bank of New York Mellon's at 60, but most of the big banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, they're kind of there in the lower 60s. And then you kind of go down. I mean, by the way, what don't you see? The UK, again, some of the Western banks are going down. You see Australian banks kind of at the bottom. I mean, it's what we talk about more or less. Western everything is not necessarily terrible, but it's drifting the wrong direction. I think you don't get the entire picture from this, again, in terms of user experience. You see more UAE banks becoming stronger. I'll tell you what, I don't think the UAE banks have a great user experience, but I think they offer good asset diversification. For me, the best value for a UAE bank is you get a personal account, you send the money there, and you forget about it for years. Try and talk to any one of those banks. I mean, you have the time of your life, but they're becoming more strong. And so I look at it as, if I have bank accounts, I might have an account that gives me a higher yield. I have accounts that are used for day-to-day purposes. I have more exotic accounts, maybe to hold exotic currencies. I've done well in the Armenian dram, the Georgian lari, up 30% in some of those holdings. That's more of a stock investment almost in some cases, high interest rates. And then I've got accounts that are just kind of more cold storage. Each bank, should fit some kind of role for your plan. And so a bank that's strong, but that has a bad user experience, might be good just to store some money, potentially have higher yields, and you're going to buy a house in 5 years, or you're going to do an M&A deal in 5 years. Some of these banks are better for trusts. So the Swiss banks, for example, are going to understand trust. The Singapore bank's not going to understand the trust. They generally don't want to open accounts for trusts at these Singapore banks. That's a personal account. So the headline is, indeed, Singapore remains strong. I love Singapore. I think they do a great job. Just love it all around. I think it works for the Nomad Capitalist vibe of just not overpaying for nothing. Pay to get something, but don't pay just to get something because in 1972, Switzerland was the best option. It's not the best option anymore. understand where Switzerland works. So what I think you can take from this, at a time when, again, in the U.S., you've seen a couple banks fail in the last year. They're talking about maybe there's one or two more that could fail. They're talking about what happens if the FDIC doesn't want to step in and give people over $250,000. If you have more than $250,000 in a bank in a Western country, in some countries it's only $100,000, 100,000 euros, I would look to diversify that cash to other places where the banks are stronger. And if the banks aren't stronger where you live, go to where the banks are stronger. Money in a bank account in the U.S. and money in a bank account in Singapore, it's the same money. It's probably going to be safer in Singapore, just my personal opinion. And so take this as an opportunity to say, okay, where can I put my cash where it's safer? And once you do that, I think it opens up a larger conversation. We're in the process of finalizing, talking to 1,000 different banks. We have the staff to do that. We have people who come on, call more banks, build more relationships. We have bankers that we have great relationships with. How can we do more business? We have some banks that work in very limited circumstances. We just found about 25 different banks that work for your offshore trust, your onshore trust, that U.S. LLC that you want a foreign bank account for, that foreign company that you want a U.S. bank account for. There's so many different banks that specialize in different things. We call all the time. We're always building relationships. We're always knocking on new doors in a way that you probably don't want to. So again, nomadcapitalist.com/apply if you want to put our insane amount of knowledge and years of experience to work for you. The safest banks are probably not where you live. Go where you're treated best. Your money doesn't have to live where you live. Just putting your money in Singapore doesn't mean you get a tax benefit. Because if you live in the U.S., if you live in Canada, if you live in Australia, that's where you're taxed. You can't just put the money offshore and save taxes. But you can potentially keep it safer. You can diversify into different currencies. Maybe you can get higher yields. And money in one bank is just as good as money at another bank. So be diversified in this time when we're seeing lower user experience. We're seeing some bank failures. You want to start to think about these things.